November 20th, 1943. 8:24 a.m. The Coral Reef off Betio Island. Private First Class Eugene Seng watched the water ahead of his Higgins boat drop from 3 feet deep to 18 inches in a matter of seconds. The tide charts had been wrong. Dead wrong. The landing craft's ramp dropped into chest-deep water 700 yards from shore. 700 yards. That's over 6 football fields of open water between the Marines and the beach. No cover, no protection. Just exposed men wading through the ocean, toward an enemy that had spent a year turning a tiny island into the most heavily fortified position in the Pacific. What happened next would shock the American public, traumatize a generation of Marines, and fundamentally change how America fought amphibious warfare for the rest of World War II and beyond. This is the story of Tarawa, an island so small you could walk across it in 20 minutes. A battle so brutal that more than 1,000 Marines died in just 76 hours of combat. A piece of coral in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that became, quite literally, a hell on Earth. But here's what makes this story even more devastating. Military planners knew it would be bad. They knew the Japanese had fortified every square foot of the island. They knew the tide might not cooperate. They sent the Marines anyway because Tarawa wasn't just another island. It was the gateway to the entire Central Pacific, and taking it was worth almost any cost. By the time the guns fell silent, 76 hours later, nearly 6,400 men would be dead. Bodies would be stacked so thick on the beaches that reinforcements would use corpses as cover. The water would literally turn red, and America would learn a hard lesson about what it would take to defeat Japan. To understand why Tarawa mattered, you need to understand where it was and what the Japanese had turned it into. Tarawa Atoll sits in the Gilbert Islands, roughly halfway between Hawaii and Australia. The strategic target was Betio, a tiny islet in the southwest corner of the atoll. When I say tiny, I mean tiny. Betio was only 290 acres. That's smaller than most American high schools. At its widest point, the island was barely 600 yards across, but size meant nothing. What mattered was location. Whoever controlled Betio controlled the Central Pacific. The Japanese had built an airstrip there that could threaten Allied supply lines to Australia. More importantly, taking Tarawa would give the United States a springboard to assault the Marshall Islands. Then the Marianas, then eventually Japan itself. The Japanese knew all of this. Rear Admiral Kenji Shibasaki, commanding the Japanese forces on Betio, had spent over a year preparing. His boast to his men became infamous. 1 million men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. That wasn't just bravado. The defenses he'd built were unlike anything the Allies had encountered. More than 4,500 Japanese troops defended the island. They'd constructed over 500 pillboxes and fortified positions. Many were made from concrete and steel, with walls 4 feet thick, reinforced with coconut logs and covered with sand. Some of the larger bunkers were built from reinforced concrete, 5 feet thick, designed to withstand direct hits from 16-inch naval guns. The entire perimeter was ringed with obstacles. The Japanese had driven hundreds of logs into the coral reef at angles designed to rip open landing craft. They'd strung barbed wire everywhere. They'd built a concrete seawall 3 to 5 feet high, running the length of the island's north shore where the Marines would have to land. And the firepower. Oh, the firepower. 8-inch naval guns salvaged from British ships. Dual-purpose, 75mm mountain guns. Dozens of 37mm anti-tank guns. Over 100 heavy machine guns. Every single one of these weapons had been pre-sighted to create interlocking fields of fire. There was literally no spot on the invasion beaches that wasn't covered by at least 3 Japanese weapons. The Japanese had turned a coral sandbar into a fortress. And in November 1943, the United States was about to slam headfirst into it. The American plan was called Operation Galvanic. Major General Julian C. Smith commanded the 2nd Marine Division, about 18,000 men who would make the assault. The plan looked good on paper. A massive naval bombardment would pulverize the Japanese defenses. Carrier aircraft would strafe and bomb anything that survived. Then the Marines would storm ashore in waves of amphibious tractors. Amtraks could drive right over the coral reef and deliver troops directly onto the beach. There was just one problem. Actually, several problems. First, the Navy only allocated 3 hours for the pre-invasion bombardment. 3 hours to destroy fortifications that had taken a year to build. Some commanders thought it wasn't enough. They were right. Second, intelligence about the coral reef was incomplete. The Marines knew there was a reef, but they weren't sure about the tides. Some maps showed 5 feet of water over the reef at high tide. Others showed 3. The actual depth could vary based on the specific phase of the moon, wind conditions, and neap tides that occurred in the Pacific. The invasion was scheduled for November 20th, if the tide was high enough. The Higgins boat's standard landing craft could cross the reef. If it wasn't, the Marines would have a problem. A big problem. Third, and this is crucial, there weren't enough The Marines had 125 of these amphibious tractors. They needed about 200. This meant that after the first 3 waves, troops would have to come ashore in regular Higgins boats, which would ground on the reef if the tide was low. Some officers raised concerns. Marine Colonel David Shoup, who would command on the ground, reportedly said, "It's going to be a hell of a show, but I think we can do it." Hell of a show. That might be the understatement of the entire war. On November 19th, the invasion fleet arrived off Betio, over 200 ships. The next morning, everything would begin. November 20th began at 4:41 a.m., when the first shells from American battleships began falling on Betio. For the next 2.5 hours, the Navy pounded the island. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers fired thousands of shells. Waves of carrier aircraft dropped bombs and napalm. One Marine watching from the transport ships later said the island looked like it was completely on fire, obscured by smoke and explosions. At 8:24 a.m., the shelling stopped. The first wave of Amtraks carrying Marines from the 3rd Battalion. 2nd Marines hit the water, heading for Beach Red 1 on the northwest corner of the island. That's when everything went wrong. The bombardment, for all its sound and fury, had accomplished almost nothing. Most of the Japanese fortifications were intact. Worse, the 3-hour delay between D-Day 1 and D-Day, caused by getting transports into position, meant the Marines were hitting the beach at a knee-up tide, one of the lowest tides of the month. The Amtraks in the first 3 waves made it over the reef. Barely. They delivered their Marines to the beach under murderous fire. Japanese defenders, who'd sheltered in their bunkers during the bombardment, emerged and opened up with everything they had. But then the disaster truly began. The 4th wave came in on Higgins boats. These flat-bottomed landing craft were designed to run up onto beaches. They were not designed to cross coral reefs. At 8:55 a.m., hundreds of Marines in dozens of Higgins boats grounded on the reef, 500 to 700 yards from shore. The coxswains dropped the ramps. Marines stepped off into chest-deep water. Some stepped into holes and went completely under, dragged down by their 70-pound packs. Those who surfaced started wading toward the beach. It took most men 20 to 30 minutes to cross that distance. 30 minutes of being completely exposed, moving at maybe 3 miles per hour through the water, while Japanese machine gunners fired at them from prepared positions. The water erupted with bullet strikes. Men fell by the dozens. Some disappeared under the waves, too wounded to stay afloat. Others made it 100 yards, 200 yards, before being hit. A few actually made it to the beach. Private First Class John Spillane later described it. "They were shooting at us like we were targets in a shooting gallery. You'd see a guy next to you, and then he'd just slip under the water and never come back up." Of the 200 men in Spillane's company, only 90 made it to shore. Of those 90, only 30 were unwounded, and that was just one company. This scene was repeating across 3 different beaches, Red 1, Red 2, and Red 3, as wave after wave of Marines tried to get ashore. Those who made it to the beach found themselves pinned down behind a concrete seawall, unable to advance. Japanese fire came from everywhere. The pillboxes that supposedly had been destroyed by the bombardment were very much operational. Machine guns, mortar, artillery, all firing on pre-sighted coordinates. Marines couldn't go forward. They couldn't go back. All they could do was hug that seawall and try to stay alive. By noon, the situation was catastrophic. Communications were spotty. Command and control had broken down. Wounded men lay everywhere. The beaches were choked with destroyed vehicles, dead bodies, and Marines who were pinned down and running out of ammunition. Colonel Shoup, who'd made it ashore and set up a command post in a Japanese bunker, sent a message back to the fleet at 12:30 p.m. Casualties, many, percentage dead, not known. Combat efficiency, we are winning. That last line, we are winning, was either incredible optimism or incredible courage. Probably both. The truth was grimmer. The 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, had landed 800 men. By midday, only 450 were alive and capable of fighting. Some companies had been effectively wiped out. Major Mike Ryan's company, on the far western edge of the island, was cut off and surrounded. But the Marines kept coming. More waves, more men wading across that killing zone of water. More bodies floating in the lagoon. The afternoon of day 1 saw small gains. Marines started using flamethrowers and demolition charges to knock out pillboxes one by one. They clawed their way a few yards inland, but it was brutal, close quarters fighting. Every bunker had to be assaulted individually. Every yard of ground costs lives. By nightfall on November 20th, the Marines held a precarious toehold on Betio. They controlled maybe 600 yards of beach. In some places, only 50 yards deep. Roughly 5,000 Marines were ashore, but they were disorganized, low on ammunition, and exhausted. The Japanese launched counterattacks throughout the night. Bonsai charges, infiltration attempts, individual Japanese soldiers with grenades. The Marines fought them off, but nobody slept. Hundreds of them, some floating, some half submerged in the shallow water. The beaches were littered with destroyed equipment, abandoned rifles, and dead Marines. Nobody could. Dawn on November 21st revealed the full horror of what had happened on day 1. The lagoon was filled with bodies. One officer estimated there were 300 bodies on a single 200-yard stretch of beach. But day 2 also brought reinforcements. The 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, and the 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines, began landing. They came across the same terrible reef, through the same killing zone, but at least now the Marines on shore could provide some covering fire. The strategy for day 2 was simple. Expand the beachhead, link up the isolated units, and push inland toward the airstrip that ran down the center of the island. This is where individual acts of heroism became too numerous to count. Staff Sergeant William Bordelon personally destroyed 3 Japanese pillboxes with demolition charges before being killed while assaulting a 4th. First Lieutenant William Hawkins led his scout sniper platoon in destroying more than a dozen Japanese positions before being mortally wounded. Both men would posthumously receive the Medal of Honor. The fighting was savage. Marines used flamethrowers to burn defenders out of bunkers, then threw grenades inside, then went in with rifles and knives to make sure everyone was dead. The Japanese fought from inside, from on top, and from tunnels connecting the bunkers. They had to be killed, individually. There was no way to make them surrender. By midday on November 21st, the Marines had captured the airstrip. This was a major objective, but it cost hundreds more casualties. Japanese snipers hidden in wrecked aircraft and shell craters continued to pick off Marines. Artillery fire from Japanese guns on the eastern end of the island made the airstrip a death trap. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Murray, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines, described the scene. There were bodies everywhere. Japanese, Americans. You couldn't walk 10 feet without stepping over someone. The smell was already getting bad. The heat was unbearable. We were running out of water, but we had to keep pushing. That afternoon, something remarkable happened. Major Mike Ryan's isolated unit on the western end of the island, the group that had been cut off since day 1, managed to push inland and secure the entire western third of Betio. Ryan's Marines, fewer than 300 men, had held off counterattacks and then gone on the offensive, clearing bunkers and pushing the Japanese back. By nightfall on day 2, the Marines controlled about half the island, but the cost continued to mount. Medical corpsmen were overwhelmed. Wounded men lay in shell craters waiting for treatment. Some bled out before help could arrive. The Marines were running low on ammunition, water, and medical supplies. The Japanese, meanwhile, were preparing for a final, desperate move. November 22nd began with a major Japanese counterattack, around 3 a.m. Several hundred Japanese troops, knowing they were going to die anyway, launched a coordinated assault on the Marine lines near the airstrip. It wasn't a mindless bonsai charge. It was a calculated attack designed to push the Marines back toward the beaches and recapture the airstrip. For 2 hours, Marines fought hand-to-hand in the darkness. Rifles, bayonets, knives, entrenching tools, fists. Some Marines ran out of ammunition and fought with whatever they could grab. The Japanese penetrated the Marine lines in several places before being driven back. When dawn broke, Marine corpsmen counted more than 300 Japanese dead in front of the Marine positions. Marine casualties from the nighttime fighting added another 70 killed and 200 wounded to the growing toll. But day 3 was when the tide truly turned, both literally and figuratively. More reinforcements came ashore. The 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, landed on the previously undefended southern beaches and began pushing north. Now, the Japanese were caught between Marine units, attacking from multiple directions. Throughout November 22nd, the Marines systematically cleared the eastern half of the island. Every bunker, every pillbox, every fortified position. The flamethrower teams became specialists in a horrific new form of warfare. Spray fire into the bunker opening. Wait for the screaming to stop. Throw in grenades. Send in riflemen to check for survivors. There were almost never survivors. By 1 p.m., organized Japanese resistance had collapsed. Individual Japanese soldiers continued fighting from bunkers and shell holes, but the battle was effectively over. Admiral Shibasaki, the commander who'd boasted about holding the island for 100 years, was found dead in his command bunker, killed by Marine artillery fire. At 1:12 p.m. on November 23rd, minus 76 hours after the first, Marines had landed. Colonel Shoup sent a message to the fleet, Betio secured. The battle was over. The counting could begin. The numbers from Tarawa are still hard to comprehend. American casualties, 1,009 Marines killed in action. 2,101 wounded. 88 missing, many of whose bodies were never recovered. Over 3,000 total casualties in 76 hours. The casualty rate was staggering, over 17% killed. For comparison, the DID landings at Normandy, involving far more troops over a much larger area, had a casualty rate of about 4%. Japanese casualties were even worse. Of the 4,836 Japanese and Korean laborers on the island, only 146 survived, 17 Japanese soldiers and 129 Korean workers. The rest, over 4,600 men, died. The Japanese fought essentially to extinction. Nearly 6,400 men died on an island you could walk across in 20 minutes. But numbers don't capture the reality. The beaches were so choked with bodies that burial details worked for days. Many dead Marines were simply pushed into shell craters and covered with sand and coral. Some were buried at sea. The Japanese dead were bulldozed into mass graves or buried where they fell. The lagoon remained filled with bodies for weeks. Navy personnel continued recovering remains months after the battle ended. When word of the casualties reached the United States, the public was shocked. Time magazine ran a graphic photo of dead Marines sprawled on the beach. The image caused an outcry. Americans began asking, was Tarawa worth it? Military commanders insisted it was the lessons learned at Tarawa about the need for longer bombardments, better intelligence on tides and reefs, more amphibious vehicles, and improved tactics for reducing fortifications would save thousands of lives in future operations. But to the Marines who fought there, the question was almost meaningless. They'd done their job. They'd taken the island. Whether it was worth it was a question for politicians and historians. Private First Class Eugene Seng, who'd waded through that deadly lagoon on day one, said it best in an interview decades later. "Don't ask me if it was worth it. Ask the guys who didn't make it." Oh wait, you can't. They're still there. Tarawa changed amphibious warfare forever. The Navy realized their pre-invasion bombardments had been inadequate. Future operations would see days of shelling, not hours. Naval gunfire support would be more precise, with better coordination between ships and ground forces. The Marine Corps completely revamped its tactics for assaulting fortified islands. They developed specialized weapons and teams for destroying bunkers. They created new training programs focused on the brutal reality of fighting in confined spaces against entrenched defenders. Most importantly, the military committed to building more amphibious vehicles. The failures at Tarawa Marines, being forced to wade hundreds of yards under fire, led to the development of improved Amtraks and other specialized landing craft. These vehicles would save countless lives at Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Tarawa also demonstrated the terrible cost of the island-hopping strategy. Each defended island would have to be taken by storm. Each would cost lives. The Japanese would not surrender. They would fight to the death, which meant American forces would have to kill them all. This realization that every Japanese-held island from Tarawa to Tokyo would be a bloodbath influenced American strategy for the rest of the war. It factored into the decision to develop and ultimately use atomic weapons against Japan. In 1945, today, Betio Island in Tarawa Atoll is a peaceful place. But remnants of the battle remain everywhere. Rusted guns, destroyed bunkers, and every year remains of Marines and Japanese soldiers are still discovered and recovered. The Defense POWARA Accounting Agency continues to identify remains from Tarawa using DNA technology. As of 2024, 374 Marines remain unaccounted for from the battle. They're still out there, somewhere beneath the sand and coral of an island most Americans have never heard of. 76 hours. That's all it took to capture an island barely larger than a shopping mall. But those 76 hours cost more than 6,400 lives. They traumatized a generation of Marines. They shocked the American public. And they changed how America fought the Pacific War. The Marines who fought at Tarawa faced the worst imaginable combat conditions: fortified positions, interlocking fields of fire, enemies who fought to the death, and terrain that offered almost no cover. They waded through hundreds of yards of killing zone. They clawed their way across beaches, choked with bodies. They fought bunker to bunker, often hand to hand, in heat and thirst and exhaustion. And they won. In 76 hours, they did what the Japanese commander had said couldn't be done in 100 years. But victory came at a price that still echoes today. Every November 20th, Marine Corps units around the world hold ceremonies commemorating Tarawa. They remember the 1,009 who died. They honor the 374 who are still missing. They remind themselves that the title Marine was earned on islands like Betio, bought with blood and courage and sacrifice. Tarawa wasn't the biggest battle of World War II. It wasn't the longest or the most strategically important. But it might have been the most brutal, pound for pound, hour for hour, acre for acre. 1 million men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. That's what Admiral Shibasaki said. He was wrong. It took 18,000 Marines, and they did it in 76 hours. But they left over 1,000 of their brothers on that tiny island. And the ones who came home carried Tarawa with them for the rest of their lives. If you found this video educational, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. We cover real World War II history, no speculation, no theories. Just the documented facts of what happened and the men who lived it. Drop a comment letting me know what battle you want to hear about next. Thanks for watching. And remember, freedom isn't free. It's paid for on islands you've never heard of by men you'll never meet.